There's two videos I want to make in the next half hour or so, and they're both about important issues. The first one will be about the issue of basically getting involved in the democratic system as a voter, and the second video will be about free speech and responsibility. So if you think you'll be interested in that subject, please watch the video. Um, okay, so firstly, democracy and voting responsibility. What's prompted me to make this is a video I've just watched with Russell Brand, and he went to the home of Lord Rothermere, who I understand is the owner of the Daily Mail, and he went peacefully to inquire as to why Lord Rothermere has overseas tax havens. This is a hot topic in the UK right now. Um, if you don't know who Russell Brand is, he's a comedian and it's a social activist in the UK. He's pretty famous, and he's become something of a kind of modern day John Lennon in that he is someone who's become famous as a social activist, and he started off as something else, the way that John Lennon started off as a singer. Then in the 70s, he became a sort of social activist. This guy's the same. He started off as a comedian. Now he's more famous for being a social political activist, very much on the political left. Um, he's an interesting man, and I want to speak a little bit about him because it does relate to what I'm going to talk about. Basically, Russell Brand clearly has strong, and my view, honest views on inequality in Britain and a lot of the social unfairness in this country. Um, I think that basically the man has his heart in the right place. I'll put it that way. But I do take issue with some of the approach that he takes. A lot of the things that Russell Brand says, I'm quite sympathetic to. He does make a lot of valid points about the hypocrisy of, for example, the Conservative Party, and also a lot of the social injustice in society. Now, critics say, well, he's a hypocrite because he's a rich guy himself. But I don't think that just because someone is wealthy, that means they cannot have a social conscience. And the thing about Russell Brand is I don't think he's doing it for attention. When I see him speak, I believe this is a man who really does believe in what he's saying. Having said that, um, he has consistently taken a position which I really, really take issue with, and that is he has actively encouraged people not to vote. He made that statement again on a recent edition of Question Time from, I believe it was from Croydon. That was the famous episode where he had a heated debate with Nigel Farage. Just to be clear, I don't agree with Russell Brand and everything. I'm just saying that I think he has a good social conscience on a lot of issues. Although he's a bit too far to the left for my liking on some other issues. Um, what he said in that Question Time event was a member of the audience challenged him and said, "If you really believe this stuff, why don't you run for office yourself?" And Russell Brand's attitude was, "Well, mate, I'd be worried I'd become one of them." So, in other words, he's now in a position where he's constantly lobbying politicians to take action on social justice issues, and that's fine. But on the same token, he's telling people not to vote. Now, to me, this is a paradoxical position. I'm not saying he's personally a hypocrite, but the position and the argument he's making is somewhat hypocritical. Um, I mean, you cannot, on one hand, attack politicians and try to stir up public animosity against them, which is essentially what he is doing, and then, by the same token, demand that they listen to him. I mean, he needs to understand that what he's doing is stirring up resentment against these people. And I really believe it's a big problem in this country. We'll show you the headline of the Daily Mirror. This is a few days ago. Your country needs you to vote. Now, it's very rare that I agree with a tabloid, but I'm objective enough to realize that they sometimes they have a use and sometimes they do hit the nail on the head. This is one such example, and I do commend the Daily Mirror for doing this. What they're getting at with that cover is that there is a very big problem in this country with a very large number of people who don't vote. Adults who are of the age of voting, i.e., above 18. There's a debate in this country about whether it should be lowered to 16. For the moment, it's 18. But there's a significant number of people who do not vote. Now, in some cases, that may be because there's been a mix-up in paperwork. Um, Someone close to me that I know cannot vote because they've messed up her paperwork. A friend of mine, and that's not because she doesn't want to vote. It's not because she's apathetic. It's because they've messed up her paperwork. My voting ballot. Show you if I can. I'm not going to show you who's on the ballot because I'm not sure if I can legally do that. This is a United Kingdom voting ballot. So basically, in that ballot, I have a choice of names for the parliamentary election, which is the person who will go to Westminster and represent Sunderland South. Sunderland Central, which is my constituency, the constituency I'm in, I should say. And there is a list of local council candidates. That is for the ward that I am in. But basically, this is what I'm holding in my hand is a symbol of the British democratic system. I suspect some of the people watching this video will come from other countries that have a democratic system, whether it be the United States or Canada or Germany or elsewhere. But you may also come from a country that has, let's say, less of a choice. But generally speaking, countries that are totalitarian in nature are not particularly tolerant to social media. So, if you're Chinese, it's unlikely that you'll be watching this from China. I have always believed that the British people do take our relative freedom for granted. And I know a lot of people scoff at this. Um, this is something I get quite reflective about and quite frustrated by to some extent. I'm someone who follows current affairs very closely and I follow the situation around the world very closely. I sometimes read a magazine called The Economist. I'll show you that so you can see it. This is The Economist. It's actually classified as a newspaper, but it's in magazine format. Um, if you're in the UK, I recommend it. It's a very comprehensive analysis of world affairs. But looking at some of the things that go on in this world, I constantly am reminded of how lucky I am to live in a country like the United Kingdom. And what I notice is whenever anyone says this, there's this peculiar reaction from a lot of my fellow countrymen and women that, oh, the system is terrible. Um, all politicians are the same. They're only in it for themselves. And it's sort of this very negative, very cynical outlook. Now, what the Daily Mirror quotes is that in 2010, 8 million men didn't vote and 9.1 million women didn't vote. This is a staggering number. I was shocked by that. It was much higher than I thought. That means a total of, what's that, 17.1 million people out of an electorate of, I believe, 45 million. Therefore, over a third, well over a third of people who could vote didn't vote. Think about that for a minute. That's a very large number of adults who did not engage in the democratic process. Now, I'm aware that in 2010 there was a big problem with some polling stations, but I suspect that probably would have run into thousands as opposed to the millions quoted there. I believe the majority of that is people who simply couldn't be bothered or they were apathetic. Now, my position is this. I believe that it is a civic duty to engage in the democratic process. However, I am open-minded enough to understand that sometimes people really feel that there isn't a party that represents their concerns. So in terms of, there has been a debate about whether we should make voting mandatory or, face a criminal fine. Some countries, I believe it's Australia and Switzerland, have that. I would support that as long as there was an extra option on the ballot paper, which was none of the above. I do support people's right to not be forced to support a particular political party. However, none of the above would still be engaging in the democratic process more than simply not being bothered to vote. Having a choice of none of the above would be a statement that these people do care about what happens in society, but they just don't have confidence in any of the parties or candidates presented. That's something I can accept. It's not something I necessarily agree with, but it's something I accept. But something I find very hard is the mentality of we just can't be bothered. If people believe that they have a conviction, an absolute conviction, and they thought it through, that all politicians are the same and they are cynical and they don't believe that the system works, then I would think that's unfortunate, but at least it's based on conviction. Although I do think that's a very big problem. But if it's simply people cannot be bothered, that to me is very worrying. Why? Because what people need to understand is the system that we have today, although it's very far from perfect. I mean, I want voting reform. I believe, for example, at present, we do not have a perfect system because, for example, you have a situation where a party like the Liberal Democrats can get more votes but fewer seats. It doesn't make sense. So we need to make a balance between the popular vote and the number of seats. We need to somehow reform the system so that it is reflective of that. Um, there have been some elections where the party leader that has got more popular votes did not end up as prime minister. There have been a few elections like that, and I know it's the same in the United States. Of course, the famous 2000 Bush-Gore thing. Although I don't want to talk too much about other countries because obviously no two systems are exactly the same. But I do believe this country needs voting reform. However, I still wish people would put things in context. Compare the situation as it is today to 1831, just before the Great Reform Act. Now, what the Great Reform Act done, and I've quoted this before in another video, I believe, there's a memorial, a monument, actually, to the Great Reform Act in Newcastle upon Tyne. It's there because Lord Grey, Earl Grey, who was Prime Minister at the time, he was the Prime Minister who presided over the Great Reform Act, and he personally was in support of it. The Duke of Wellington was opposed to it. That's just for a bit of political context. Now, the Great Reform Act certainly didn't create the sort of situation we have today because it didn't extend to women. But what it did do was significantly increase the number of men who could vote. Now, that was a massive step forward. And then there was a democratic process that was gradual. Throughout the 19th century, there was Chartists. And then in the 20th century, of course, we had suffragettes. Um, Women over the age of 30 got the vote in 1918, and then all women got the vote in 1928 under, I believe it was the Baldwin administration. Actually, 28, that would have been, might have been 26, forgive me, I don't know the exact year, but it was in the late 20s, that's when full female suffrage came about. So there was a long, long process going from Magna Carta in 1215 right up to 1926, 28, and onwards, and we're still far from perfect. But when people say, for example, politicians need to listen to the people, something strikes me about that. What people forget is actually pretty much every politician in the House of Commons is elected from the people. You need to look at this in context compared to the situation as it was, say, prior to the English Civil War. Now, people can say, oh, but the Westminster insiders. Well, yeah, they are, a lot of them, and that is something that I can understand puts people off. But in the end of the day, we have got to a situation now where everyone in the House of Commons is from the people. The House of Lords is a different matter. I understand there's debate about that. But those who are sitting in the House of Commons are elected from the people. Yes, you can say at the age of 23 they became, Westminster insider. There's others who have had careers outside politics. They have been soldiers, they've been doctors, they have been trade unionists, they've been a wide range of different things. So I sometimes feel quite frustrated when some of my countrymen and women make sweeping statements about this without putting it into the context of our history. Why is this important? It's important because compared to a very large part of the world, we do have a significant level of freedom. I agree actually with what Sajid Javid said. He's a Conservative Party culture spokesman. He said it in that Croydon, I believe it was the same question time debate. He said, if people reflect on the lack of freedom, the lack of free expression, the lack of voting rights in many parts of the world, and then look at Britain, maybe they'll be just a little bit more grateful for what we actually have. Is the system perfect? No, it isn't. Are reforms needed? Yes, they are. But in my view, our system is not so bad that it warrants 17 million people not voting. I would say those people are not being responsible citizens. And people might see that as offensive, but I believe that it's it's actually a betrayal of the men and women who actually literally died for the right to have a vote. I mean, especially in the case of 9.1 million women who didn't vote, do those women not realize what suffragettes went through? I mean, do they not understand that? And men who don't vote, do they not understand the suffering that Chartists went through? Those brave men who went on to Clapham Common in the 1840s, often with the threat of a police truncheon, just to get the right to vote. So sometimes I feel very frustrated when people come out with things like, oh, they're all the same, because to me that is not really reflecting on how far we have actually come. Because actually, the people who were Chartists and suffragettes are basically the ancestors of today's MPs in many cases. Think about it. The founder of the Labour Party, Keir Hardie, was an ex-miner. And many of the suffragettes later became elected MPs. So they are the ancestors of today's parliamentarians. So when people say they're all the same, or when they say that they're not from the people, I think that's a very, very ignorant statement. I don't mind people saying they disagree with a particular policy or they don't like a particular candidate, but people really, really need to think about what they're saying. Because to me, it shows an astonishing lack of understanding in history and just how far we have come. We can always go further, we can always improve, but I do think that we need to be grateful for how far we have come, especially in a world where there are people who have absolutely no rights. In a country like Eritrea, where a lot of the migrants who drowned the other day were trying to escape from. You know, I have a friend from Syria, and he told me that he cannot comprehend why young jihadists are going off to fight in his country when they don't understand what they have in this country. They don't understand how fortunate they are. Now, this is not to say that the United Kingdom doesn't have social problems. In no way would I ever make such a ridiculous statement. We do have social problems. But we also have political stability at a level many countries don't have. I mean, when I listen to my friend from Syria, and I listen to him, he said he speaks to his mother and he can hear gunfire. He can hear gunfire on the other end. So when I hear people say that this country is shit, I just think, well, if you're talking about a specific situation, okay. But to make that sort of sweeping statement, I think is very wrong. We have serious problems in this country. There are a lot of people that rely on food banks. Unemployment is a lot higher than what the official figures suggest. There are people being driven to suicide through government cuts programs. So those are all very serious issues. But to try and make sweeping statements that the country is shit and that the whole system is rotten, I think that is doing a disservice to our ancestors who suffered greatly and struggled years and years for our right to vote. So for me, I hold this in my hand and I feel grateful to be a British citizen. I really do. Now, does that mean that the choice is something that I absolutely like? Does it mean I am hugely enthusiastic for everyone in that ballot? No, maybe it doesn't mean that. But the point is I have a choice. If I wanted to, I could destroy this ballot and nothing would happen. I don't think people should, and I'm not advocating that. But people just need to understand the context of this. So, yeah, I do have quite strong views on this. We cannot take for granted what we have. That doesn't mean that we have to be sheepish and just accept it the way it is. We can improve. But what I can't accept is sweeping ignorant statements that to me really, really overlook just how far we have come. I've spoken for a long time here, so I'll close it up here. But we do have a democracy in this country. Is it perfect? No, it's not. But you know what? Maybe democracy never will be perfect. Maybe it is the nature of democracy that it will never be perfect. But I would rather have an imperfect democracy rather than a totalitarian system whereby the streets are clean, but you have to be careful what you say. Think about that for a minute. And if you're British and you're thinking, oh, they're all the same, I'm not going to vote. I would urge you to really consider what I've said. I'm not telling you what to do, but I do believe it is a civic duty to vote. Because if you don't vote, you're not engaging in the democratic process. In my opinion, you shouldn't complain. Or at least if you're going to be so outspoken and make these sort of sweeping statements and say it's all shite, well then take some responsibility and put yourself up as a candidate. Stand as an independent candidate. If you think all the other candidates are rubbish, then stand as an independent. At council level, it's part-time, so you don't have to work all year round, but at least you'd be putting your money where, at least you'd be putting your words with some level of conviction. Otherwise, to me, frankly, you're just a whinger. I'm sorry to be blunt about that, but that's how I feel about this. And if you're maybe disabled, you can't, and you have some restrictions on standing yourself, then at least look at in depth at the party manifestos without making sweeping statements. Believe me, they're not all the same. There are big ideological differences between the parties. Vote for UKIP, vote for the Greens, vote for Labour, vote for the Tories, vote for someone. But in my opinion, please vote. Thanks for watching.